Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start off by first thanking Sri Lanka Inc. for organizing this event, and I'm confident that it will provide more avenues to discuss this resolution and the events surrounding it. My paper will very briefly explore 4 topics, that of multilateral affairs, geopolitics, economic and trade issues, and the issue of the one-size-fits-all model. Now, any form of discussion on this resolution becomes so highly politicized that it is now presumed that you are either anti-government or pro-former government, or that you are pro or anti-US, or that you are pro or anti-UN if you have any sort of opinion on it. But the background and context of this resolution is not so simply polarized, and it's far more complex. And if we are not careful, we can get so caught up in the politicization that we can miss the legitimate issues that surround it. These ramifications impact both the macro level in relation to Sri Lanka as a sovereign entity, and ultimately trickle down to the micro level in relation to the lives of individual Sri Lankans, you and me sitting in this room. Briefly looking at multilateral issues in relation to the resolution, if you look at the statements of the countries that have voted against this resolution since its adoption in 2012, you will notice a clear pattern. They note that the resolution was unnecessary and uncalled for, considering that Sri Lanka had always cooperated with the UN system and its bodies. They further note concerns that the resolution had reversed the decision taken by the 2009 special session when the Council was requested to support Sri Lanka in its internal efforts towards resettlement and reconciliation. They also note that Sri Lanka had provided regular updates to on the internal situation in the country. And finally, because of these reasons, there was further concern that this resolution pointed to the fact that the Council was used as a trigger mechanism, that is, as a political tool by powerful states to control smaller developing states. Now, in terms of multilateral affairs, by now sponsoring this resolution, we are distancing ourselves and our stand from the points just referred to. So if there are then numerous Sri Lankan analysts, including those sitting on this panel, and numerous global entities, including those international governments, who have voiced their concern regarding this resolution, who are saying fundamentally that this resolution is not about altruistic efforts, then it's important to deconstruct what the resolution and surrounding events are about, and how those events can ultimately affect us. What is important in any discussion of this nature is context and basis, and these are 2 themes that my presentation will try to come back to. I'd like to start with the most contentious issue, and that is geopolitics. For the most part, the discussion tends to become so politicized because since the resolution's adoption in 2012, many have pointed out that this US-led initiative was more to do with regime change than the protection of human rights or promoting reconciliation. In fact, Ambassador Gunaratne made this argument before 2012, and she noted that the resolution was part of a system that legitimized intervention, and what it was seeking was a system change. But at that point of time, not many people, including those in the government, were listening. And there is a context and basis to that argument. And looking at context and basis is the only way in which to quieten the white noise of saying that if you bring up this point, you're simply a conspiracy theorist. As such, the arguments here should not be focused on the previous or present regime per se, but on the need on the part of the US for establishing control. And this need for control is connected to Sri Lanka's geopolitical significance to the US. For instance, the Committee on Foreign Relations, submitting its report to US Congress in 2009, in the report titled Recharting US Strategy After Sri Lanka's War, notes that Sri Lanka is, and quoting from the report, Sri Lanka is strategically located at the nexus of maritime trading routes connecting Europe and the Middle East to China and the rest of Asia. It is directly in the middle of the old world, where an estimated half of the world's container ships transit the Indian Ocean. And among the numerous flags that the report raises about Chinese activity in Sri Lanka, it notes that, I quote, even for those that dismiss China's string of pearls strategy as overblown, there is concern about growing Chinese influence on the Sri Lankan government. It is important to also note at this juncture that US naval and marine core vision strategies in 2007 and 2008 changed, asserting that the two oceans of relevance for the US would no longer be the Atlantic and Pacific, but the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And if you look at countless US reports on Sri Lanka after the war, the main themes should have been reconciliation and human rights protection, but a large chunk deals with strategic geopolitical significance. You would recall Secretary Kerry's statement in May this year that confirms this. In that sense, we at home have a very misplaced view of the country and its place in the world, that it's simply a dot in the Indian Ocean. But global powers have long seen not simply the country's significance, but its immense significance in terms of geopolitical placement. In that sense, Sri Lanka may not be a superpower, but we are without a doubt a superposition, and that should not be overlooked. So if you have this tiny state that is of extreme geopolitical significance to you, and what you would ideally require then is an accommodating government so that your interests can be solidified and protected. If that accommodation is not present, it doesn't matter what the regime is, a change would be construed as necessary. And if you don't know history, that may sound like a conspiracy theory, but this is a strategic political tool that has been perfected by the United States over the years. Nicaragua, Guatemala, Iraq are but a few examples that history has provided us with. Now, if you read some of the work of Ryan Goodman, who is the co-editor of Just Security and the special counsel to the General Counsel of the US Department of Defense, if you read his work on the resolution and on relations with Sri Lanka, you can see a subtle but clear insinuation of the benefits of maintaining control over the government in order to secure US interests here. He even goes as far as to say in one article how the US could help to politically marginalize certain political elements in order to consolidate the power of the government. Now, please don't get sidetracked. Don't start thinking, former regime, current government, what is she talking about? Our focus should move out of this polarity of party politics in Sri Lanka and rest on the principle that Ryan Goodman is talking about. And it doesn't matter how sugar-coated it is, because what he's talking about is essentially strategic interference in the affairs of another state in order to pursue your own interests. The danger then is whatever change that the resolution or trade plans or technical assistance from the US aims at, it is not in the context or basis of what Sri Lanka as a country needs, but is dependent on what American national interest requires. And it is important to look at the repercussions of this formula. And that brings me to the theme of economic and trade issues. For one thing, this control that would need to be exerted will need to go across the board in Sri Lanka, including the areas of economy and trade. This is the usual model that the US uses, and any article that critically analyzes neoliberal policies will explain this. That way, if the government they're dealing with steps out of line, they would either have a very big carrot, a trade or economic dependency, for instance, or a very big stick, like a UNHRC resolution, or both, in order to keep that government in check. The main aim, however, is control. In this light, you would recall Secretary Kerry's statement in May this year that affirmed that the US would provide technical assistance to the government as it makes constitutional and democratic reforms, and that the Commerce and Treasury departments of the US will send advisors to help develop a plan for more investment and economic growth. If the United States is offering advice anywhere in relation to commerce, investment, or economic growth, it would fundamentally be based on the principles of neoliberalism and free trade. Now, everyone knows that there are advantages in this system, but more recently, analysts and business people alike have flagged the dangers of this model. How the focus is on growth and not equitable growth. How this model benefits large multinationals, but how smaller national players are unable to compete. And there is further concern on how the IMF and World Bank fit into this mix, as was the case in Jamaica, and how it results in the dangerous dependency of smaller developing states on loans. If what Secretary Kerry talked about in May is now fleshed out in terms of negotiations, advice, or technical assistance, then there needs to be transparency with regard to those negotiations, an assessment of what's being negotiated and how it will impact Sri Lanka's business and farming communities. You may recall that Ambassador Jeffrey Lundstedt, who served in Sri Lanka from 2003 to 2006, specifically talked about the kind of government system that the US would support in Sri Lanka, and that it is one that favors market-oriented economic reform, pro-free trade, and globalization. In the same report, he notes how the US believed, and I quote, that economic incentives could help motivate the domestic players to make the political choices needed, unquote. And this is the use of economic incentives as a carrot or stick that I was talking about earlier. And if we step back for a second, you see that this is nothing personal on the part of the US, because here in Sri Lanka, we tend to take things very personally, but this is business as usual. The US occupies a prominent place in global politics. Sri Lanka has always been of geopolitical significance, and what has been required over time is an accommodating government in order to safeguard US interests here. And if that security is lacking, they will find other means in order to ensure compliance. When you see through that lens, you start becoming aware that whatever discussions are taking place, whether it's social, political, trade, or economic, it is about US interests, not Sri Lanka's. I would like to conclude with the issue of the one-size-fits-all model. Now, apart from the issues raised regarding the warranting of a resolution not being based on a genuine or altruistic effort towards Sri Lanka's betterment, there's also the issue of the one-size-fits-all model, and this is something that has been debated at the UN itself. For instance, there is an understanding that there is no one model of development, which is what the free trade model often tries to push for. In the same vein, I would say that there is no one model of reconciliation. The minute you start operating in this one-size-fits-all mentality, you remove the context of the situation, and you're focusing more on the model or mechanism you want to implement. The context of issues that has surrounded Sri Lanka is suddenly removed, and it becomes easy for the UN Secretary General to suddenly refer to Sri Lanka on par with Rwanda. And in turn, that comparison would justify whatever mechanism that is being insisted upon. And don't get me wrong, I don't think anyone who meaningfully works for the UN would ever want the establishment known as a trigger mechanism. But it is an establishment which is in the hands of its member states. And if some of its member states are turning it into a trigger mechanism for their own interests, and the rest of its member states are politically too disenfranchised to do something about it, then it is a very serious and grave problem. And the precedence that has been set with this US-led resolution, as it will affect every area of life in Sri Lanka, can in turn affect other developing states based on the agendas of the powerful, which is why it's so important that more discussions like this take place. I have glossed over a certain number of facts that I have, but if you would like to have the full statement as I was hoping to give it, I'll be more than willing to share it at the end of the panel discussion. Thank you.